Hello and thank you so much for joining me in this video. Today I'm going to talk about decolonizing research in Africa. This is a very important topic to me, and it's a topic that actually touches my heart. My name is Ronald Kaunda, and I run a website called ronaldkaunda.com. You can also find me on YouTube using the handle Ronald Kaunda. So what are we going to learn in this presentation? We are going to start with the background of colonialism and how it has impacted on the African way of knowledge production and African ways of knowledge sharing. We are going to talk about scientific colonialism, the status of research in Africa, research paradigms, African indigenous research paradigms, decolonizing research methodologies, and the process of decolonization. I want to mention from the beginning that it will be a long presentation, but you enjoy riding this vehicle with me. So let's get into it without wasting much of your time. We know that we cannot talk about decolonization of research without talking about colonialism. Why? Because if we understand where we are coming from, it will be easy to chant a way forward or to go where we are going. So colonization is defined as the subjugation of one group by another. Again, we understand for us in Africa that in 1884, European countries which were powerful at the time met in Berlin in order to divide Africa into territories and colonies. In Africa, almost all countries were divided up for grab except for Ethiopia. Colonialism destroyed political and socio-economic systems that were used prior to the coming of Europeans to Africa. It led to external political control and economic dependence on the West. So most African countries depended on the West to provide everything. This process, the process of colonization, resulted in scientific colonization. So let's take time and talk about scientific colonization. What is scientific colonization? Science deals with the production of knowledge. Scientific colonization is the control of knowledge in the colonies or former colonies, where the former colonizer controls how knowledge is produced, how knowledge is disseminated or shared, and how people do things. That becomes scientific colonization. Scientific colonization is the imposition of the colonizer's ways of knowing on the colonized other. Now, in Africa, we know that this started with missionaries, settlers, and explorers who claimed to have discovered things in Africa. They gave names to territories, they gave names to lands, to rivers, lakes, waterfalls, and other natural showcases that were in Africa because they were in control of that. This was a violent way of dismissing indigenous people's knowledge. For example, rivers and lakes were known by indigenous people in indigenous languages. In Zambia, where I come from, we have one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Victoria Falls. The Victoria Falls, up to date, it's known Shunguna Mtitima or Mosotunya by the local people. In Lozi, it's called Mosotunya. Lozi is one of the languages that are spoken in Zambia, and in Tonga, it's known as Shunguna Mtitima. But these names were changed, were grabbed from the local people and replaced with Victoria Falls by explorers and missionaries, specifically by David Livingstone, who named the Victoria, or who renamed Shunguna Mtitima to Victoria Falls after his queen at the time. And scientific colonization resulted in disconnecting people from what they knew and how they knew it. For example, people knew Shunguna Mtitima as Shunguna Mtitima, but they were disconnected from that name, and they were given, because it was now given a new name. Scientific colonialism gave researchers unlimited rights of access to any data source and information belonging to the African people. And African people almost lost their grab on their own knowledge. These researchers, these first newcomers, carried out the notion that they had the right to data and to process it into books without involving indigenous people. With that data, the Europeans who came to Africa developed standards and formulations by which all the people of the world actually could be understood. But now it is understood that you cannot fit every culture, every race into one shoe, because different people have got different worldviews and different ways of doing, different ways of speaking, and different ways of transmitting knowledge. Today, researchers accept and perpetuate oppressive perspectives as the norm. In summary, scientific colonization speaks to the imposition of positivist paradigms on the indigenous people. Research on or among indigenous people were carried out using positivist paradigms, which are Western, which are Eurocentric, and these are imposed on people, and the data collected from such people is interpreted using the lenses of Europeans who came. Let's look at the status of research in Africa. Conducting research in Africa can take three shapes or forms. I have put this diagram, which you can see on the screen, and in the outermost layer, you can see that there is research which does not involve Africans. It is conducted by Western or European researchers, or let me just say by people who use Western research methodologies and paradigms. And then we've got research that is conducted in Africa, and this research involves indigenous communities to a certain extent. We are going to discuss this further. The third and final form of research or type of research is that which is conducted by Africans who understand in African indigenous research ways. This research is called Afrocentric indigenous research. Afrocentric or African indigenous research. So let's look at these different layers one by one. Let's start with the outer layer. This is research not involving indigenous Africans. This research is conducted by researchers who come from outside Africa, who've got no idea how life is in Africa, who've got no idea about the socio and cultural context of Africa. They just come to conduct that research, collect their data, and they go. So they actually obtain data without involving Africans at the level of decision making or at the level of data interpretation. They just collect that data, they take it in raw form, then they interpret it using Western methodologies of data analysis. They interpret the findings without including the voices of African indigenous people. Knowledge acquired from such research is taken out of context because there is no insider voice added to that research. And publications that are made from such research contain factually incorrect information. This kind of research has got little or actually no impact on the African communities themselves. Why? Because it does not involve them as people who are being researched. Let's look at research in the second inner layer. This kind of research is conducted by Western researchers but involve indigenous communities or researchers. So this is a level where Western researchers partner with some members of the communities in Africa and they conduct research. Indigenous researchers are involved at the level of subjects, at the level of participants, but they do not have influence on the whole research process. So Africans as indigenous people, and I don't just mean Africans or people who live in Africa. I'm talking about people that have got indigenous knowledges and they understand the nuances of language use, the use of proverbs, and the type of life that Africans live. There is negotiation involved in terms of research, and some kind of partnership is established between researchers and indigenous community members who volunteer to participate in this kind of research. The participatory nature of this kind of research fosters an exchange of knowledge between researchers and the communities who are involved in this kind of research. However, in most cases, indigenous participants are treated as informants only. So people that you just get information from and they are not given that respect that they deserve, and their knowledge is undervalued, because in most cases this kind of research, or researchers that conduct this kind of research, have got their own worldviews that they impose on the data that they collect. The final form of research is Afrocentric research. This research is conducted by Africans who understand African indigenous knowledge, African indigenous ways of knowledge production. These people understand the social structure and cultural values of African indigenous communities. This type of research is envisaged to fulfill the intellectual materials, the cultural and spiritual needs of indigenous people. We will understand this further when we begin to talk about research paradigms, and specifically when we talk about African indigenous research paradigms. Research where indigenous African people are significant participants and typically senior members of the research teams. Senior members of the research team are African indigenous people. Primarily, this kind of research meets expectations and quality standards which are set by indigenous communities in Africa. In terms of analysis, this kind of research takes an Afrocentric approach, and the interpretation of such research gives rise to an Afrocentric kind of view to the research. It produces indigenous African knowledge that recognizes the African voice that tells another story. So it's not a usual Western story that is told in this kind of research. It is a story that is told by indigenous people themselves. It reaffirms the centrality of cultural experience as the place to create a dynamic multicultural approach to research. So when you begin to talk about Afrocentric research or indigenous African research, you're talking about research that recognizes the cultural experiences of the people who are involved, but also the cultural experiences of people that are involved at the level of interpreting the data that is collected. What has been the impact of the outer layer? Now, just a reminder, you might have forgotten, the outer layer is that layer where there is research conducted by Westerners or by people using Western methodologies without involving Africans at any level, maybe just as informants or as subjects to be studied. Western research paradigms have created and perpetuated what one scholar, Said Hussein Aletas from Malaysia, called the captive mind. Now, according to Chilisa, the concept of the captive mind refers to the uncritical imitation of Western research paradigms within scientific intellectual activity. If you go in academia and other aspects of life where research is conducted in Africa, you find that Africans use Western methodologies and apply them in social and cultural contexts which may not necessarily require to use such methodologies. Why? Because they just know that this is a research methodology in social research, and they use it and misapply it on the wrong context. Again, because of this, it has led to the colonization of the African mind. Apart from subjugation of the territory of the land, because of scientific colonization, the outcome has been the colonization of the African mind, which just follows Western ways of doing without questioning how those research methodologies impact on the outcomes of the research that is conducted. It involves stripping the formerly colonized and historically marginalized groups of their ancestral culture and replacing it with Euro-Western culture and languages. And you can see that this is very prevalent in education systems where learners are actually taught in foreign languages. This is why we've got countries which were colonized by Great Britain using English as a formal language, used in administration, formal language used in education. Africans, as a result, begin to deny themselves even languages. I remember one day I was a teacher of a local language, Bemba, at Alliance Francaise in Lusaka, and one parent brought her child to learn French. and I asked her if she could actually bring her child to a class where I was teaching Bemba. She just asked me one question and said, where will Bemba take my child? And I didn't want to argue with her, because when I think about these things, I begin to think about the captive mind and the mental colonization, or the colonization of the African mind. We cannot ask where your own language will take you, because it is an embodiment of your culture, an embodiment of the knowledge systems which may not be in books. And we need to talk about these things because African knowledge resides out there, resides out there in the community and not in the library as Western knowledge does. Let's talk about research paradigms. Again, this video is not about defining what research paradigms, but I'm going to talk about research paradigms in the context of this presentation. According to Bogdan and Bicklin, a research paradigm is a loose collection of logically related assumptions, concepts, and propositions that orient thinking and research. So when you're doing research, you need to choose a research paradigm that is going to guide how you're going to think about the whole process of research and how you're going to conduct your data collection and your data analysis, the methods that you're going to use, and the values and the ethics that you're going to be involved with during the research process. Now, a research paradigm can also be seen as shared beliefs among members of a specialty and applicable to that entire research community. Now, this is also very important to understand that research paradigms differ even within the same group, because you may find that there are educationists who believe that reality is like this and therefore it can be found or obtained like that. We need to understand that a paradigm can either change over time or actually even fall out of fashion. Why? Because paradigms are essentially just worldviews, how you see things, how you see reality. And that could be at individual level or at group level, as we have seen. Now, a paradigm provides guidance, and this is what is important about research paradigms, is because they provide guidance about which questions to ask and how to answer them. I present to you this table about research paradigms, or the popular research paradigms, but I want to concentrate on the last column where we talk about indigenous research paradigms. In indigenous research paradigms, before I talk about this, let me say that when we are conducting research and when we have narrowed down to a research paradigm, we need to start thinking about questions that we need to ask, things that we need to put into place, like how we see reality. So we need to ask ontological questions. We need to ask epistemological questions. We need to talk about axiology and the methodologies, because this is one package. So in indigenous research questions, talking about ontology, indigenous research paradigms ontologically are relativist, rational, multiple, socially constructed, and realities are socially constructed. Their mutual reality are based on the multitude of relationships. We are going to understand this when we narrow down to indigenous research paradigms, but we need to know that the multitude of relationships that African people share help define what reality is in that context. In terms of epistemology, reality is intersubjective, it is experiential, knowledge is relational, so it's very important to understand this. In terms of methodologies, one can use participatory methodologies, liberatory methodologies, transformative methodologies, which are positioned in indigenous knowledge systems. If you want, you can pause this video and look at some of these assumptions that are made in terms of ontology, epistemology, and methodologies. But I'm going to move on and talk about the African indigenous research paradigm. Indigenous research paradigm is a body of indigenous and theoretical approaches and methods, rules, and postulates employed by indigenous researchers in the study of indigenous peoples. Now, when we're beginning to think about conducting research among indigenous people, we should not impose our own worldviews or our own research paradigms. like positivist paradigms. We need to start thinking about how we can do this among indigenous people. So we need to think about theoretical approaches and indigenous and theoretical approaches and methods which we need to employ. Indigenous research paradigms are informed by relational ontology, relational epistemology, and relational axiology. You can find this in Chilisa's 2012 book. So an indigenous research paradigm recognizes participants as active agents in the knowledge production process. It includes indigenous ways of knowing with the aim of valuing indigenous research conducted by and for the indigenous communities, valuing the methods that are created by and for indigenous people in the process of research. In terms of ontology, the adage I am, and now this is talking about sub-Saharan African people. The adage that I am because we are popular among the Bantu people of Africa sums up the relational ontological position adopted in the study of African people as indigenous people. And now we need to begin to understand this, that reality in terms of the way people look at, in terms of the way indigenous African people look at, is in terms of how they relate with each other, how they relate with the environment, the cosmic environment, and the spiritual realm. In sub-Saharan Africa, Ubuntu worldview expresses an ontology that addresses relations among people, relations with the living and non-living, and the spiritual existence that promotes love and harmony among peoples and communities. So when you talk about ontology, we are talking about such relations, and these relations are very important because to understand reality among sub-Saharan African people, we need to understand how they relate to these things, their environment, the trees, the rivers, the mountains, the animals, the totems, and other things. Knowing or knowledge is something that is constructed by individuals who share relationship and connections. So again, ontologically, knowledge or knowing is constructed by individuals who share relationships and connections. The relationship between reality and the knower is that knowers are seen as beings with connections to other beings, the spirits of the ancestors, and the world around them that inform what they know and how they know it. Knowledge has a connection with the knower, and knowledge is stored in the language, practices, that is, cultural practices, rituals, proverbs, revered traditions, myths, and folk tales. These use of language perpetuate what an African person knows and how he comes to know about it. The ontological position and the adage I am because we are shows the interconnections established between people and their living and non-living objects within their own environment. Now, this whole situation is expressed in the communal type of living which African people enjoy. This is the reality because people are connected to each other and to nature. This ontological position views reality as relative, relational, multiple socially constructed realities, mutually constructed based on multitude of relationships. Research and the participants must work together to establish reality. So there is that connection between the researched and the researcher. Remember, I talked about 2 levels of research. The first 3 levels of research or 3 forms of research. The second and outermost levels, we said the researcher collects data and they interpret without involving the African people. But this is different when you use an African indigenous paradigm, because the researcher and the researched must work together to come up with reality. In terms of epistemology, in African relational epistemology, the researcher focuses on the relational forms of knowing. So the relational forms of knowing guide what is to be known. Knowing or knowledge is something that is constructed by individuals that share connections. The relationship between reality and the knower is that knowers are seen as beings with that connections, as we have said already. Knowledge has a connection with the knower, and knowledge is stored in their language. Reality, therefore, can be uncovered using indigenous research methodologies. This knowledge is practiced in various fields such as medicine, science, religion, childbearing, agriculture, and other forms of education. Reality can be uncovered using indigenous research methodologies. What are considered to be good methodologies using the African indigenous paradigms? According to Possenger, talking generally about indigenous people, indigenous methodology is a body of indigenous and theoretical approaches and methods, rules, and postulates employed by indigenous research in the study of indigenous people. So when we talk about research methodology, we're talking about rules that govern how you conduct data, how you collect the data, and how you interpret that data. An indigenous research methodology summarizes how the research proceeds. So methodology is the place where assumptions about the nature of reality, knowledge, values, and theory and practice on a given topic converge. Indigenous research methodologies lie in the process of decolonizing and indigenous Euro-Western methodological imperialism and hegemony, as well as a call for the adapting of conventional methodologies by including perspectives and methods that draw from indigenous knowledges, languages, metaphors, worldviews, experiences, and philosophies of former colonized, historically oppressed and marginalized social groups. So when you read Harold in his 2019 article, he explains very clearly that the process of decolonizing, research methodologies lie in the process of decolonizing. So when you engage in this kind of research, it is not appropriate to go with Western methodologies and claim to have conducted indigenous research simply because you conducted that research among indigenous people. It is important to understand that this kind of research should aim at decolonizing and decolonizing the process and indigenizing Euro-Western methodological imperialism that have been imposed on African people in terms of the way that the data is collected and in terms of the way the data is disseminated. Indigenous methodologies include the process of decolonizing the conventional techniques of interviews using indigenous interview methods such as talking circles and conversational interviews. So when you think about methodologies and methods, you need to start thinking about how do African indigenous people acquire information? What methods best suit the way they naturally acquire their own information? So instead of using such research methods as interviews, why not use talking circles? Because naturally African people sit around a fire in circles and chat and share information. So using such methods that suit the way Africans live their lives will be more important in the process of decolonizing research methodologies in Africa. It invokes indigenous knowledge to inform alternative research methods which are in line with the worldview of the colonized other. So using indigenous or alternative methods, alternative research methods is important when we think about African indigenous research methods, because they provide an alternative to the Western methods which have been imposed on African people. Indigenous methodologies can be defined as research by and for indigenous peoples using techniques and methods drawn from the traditions and knowledges of those people. So when you think about indigenous research methodology or methods, these are methods for indigenous people, created by indigenous people, and those methods must be based or must be drawn from the traditions and knowledges of the indigenous people themselves. You cannot impose methods on them simply because you conducted the research on them. It should be grounded in the data collected by the people, by indigenous people, and formulated by indigenous people. Okay, let's talk about axiology in the indigenous research methodologies or paradigms. To begin with, axiology refers to the analysis of values to better understand their meaning, characteristics, origin, purpose, and acceptance as true knowledge and their influence on people's daily experiences. So when you talk about data integrity and data, the values and the origin of purpose and acceptance of knowledge as true knowledge, axiology is the term that we use for that. It deals with the nature of ethics, aesthetics, religion, and spirituality. When you talk about indigenous research methodologies, in this sense, it deals with the ethics. How do you conduct data? Do you come as a Western or European? And again, when I talk about European, I'm not just talking about European people. I'm talking about people coming with Eurocentric mindset when dealing with indigenous people. Axiology, in terms of indigenous research paradigm, takes a relational approach. It is built on the concept of relational accountability, which involves respect and respect representation, reciprocal appropriation, rights, and regulation. So remember, again, I'll take you back when we talked about the three forms of research in Africa. We said that in the outer layer, research conducted by Western or Euro-Western researchers does not respect Africans. Their knowledge is not valued. In terms of value, in terms of data integrity, when you think about African indigenous research methodology and its values, the first place to start with is to respect their worldviews, to respect what they think it is and how they obtain it. In the Ubuntu worldview, the I am because we are requires the researcher to see himself as a member of the colonized other. Because this is some kind of, let me just say, Ubuntu deals with our connections to each other and to the environment. Now, how can you obtain data if you are not connected to the people from whom you are getting the data? So you need to see yourself as a member of the colonized other, and you need to respect the researched as one would love to be respected. So the way you would want to be respected is the same way you need to respect their views. It is the same way you need to respect them as people. And you should feel the belongingness. Now, there are people that might never feel the belongingness, because feeling like you belong requires that you stay long among people. You need to stay long to begin to integrate within the community. But reality tells us that when conducting research, sometimes we just go and collect the data. This is very important. You need to involve people that already belong to the community so that your research becomes part and parcel of the people among which the research is being conducted, not just as participants, but also at the level where they can make decisions. They can help you understand what is valued in that community and what is not. Let's look at decolonizing methodologies. Decolonizing is a process of centering the concerns and worldviews of the colonized other so that they understand themselves through their own assumptions and perspectives and worldviews. So when we begin to talk about decolonizing research, we are bringing to the fore or to the front the process of centering the concerns and worldviews of the colonized other. Instead of interpreting the data using Eurocentric, we need to begin to think about Afrocentric ways of doing, ways of seeing, ways of doing, and ways of sharing information. It is an event, but it is also a process which involves creating and using various strategies to liberate the captive mind. So decolonizing methodologies mean that we need to start thinking about the captive mind and how that captive mind can be liberated. Why is this important? Remember, we said that the captive mind uses Western methodologies without asking whether those methodologies will be suitable or suited for the kind of research they need to get among and from indigenous people. At this point, we need to start cleansing and exercise the captive mind so that they begin to think about centering or using Afrocentric approaches. It involves restoring and developing cultural practices, thinking patterns, beliefs, and values that are still necessary and relevant to the survival and birth of new ideas within the Afrocentric worldviews. To decolonize methodologies then means that indigenous scholars are indigenizing research by adopting and adapting Western methods and methodologies so that they are culturally sensitive and safe under an indigenous research paradigm. Let me mention here that the process of decolonizing research should and does not mean that we are throwing away Western research methodologies, but we need to adapt them in African indigenous research methodologies. In other words, decolonizing Western methodologies means locating power within the indigenous community. Power must belong to the indigenous, African indigenous communities instead of researchers. Remember we said at the beginning of this presentation that when Western researchers came, and Western explorers and settlers and missionaries who started appropriating African knowledge and writing it into books without consulting Africans, they thought they had the power to do that. They had the rights to do that. We need to start getting that and putting it back to the people that actually deserve to own it. The process of decolonization. Let us now talk about the process of decolonization. There are 5 phases or stages that Postcolonial suggested in 2000, and I use these to talk about what we can do to decolonize research in Africa. Number 1, we need to do a rediscovery and recovery. Remember, when missionaries and settlers and colonizers came, they discovered us because we never knew we were existing. They actually discovered our rivers and they changed the names. They discovered everything that we had for us and about us. So we need to engage in the process in which the colonized other rediscover and recover their own culture, history, language, and their own identity. We need to do this. We need to integrate the captive mind to define in their own terms what is real to them. So instead of uncritically following research methodologies that are well suited in Western countries, we need to start thinking about how we need to start thinking about those methods and see if they really fit. If they cannot fit, we discard them. If they can vaguely fit, then we need to adapt them to suit our own cultural environment. The colonized other must define their own rules on what can be known, what can be spoken, written about, how and when and where. In African communities, there are certain knowledges that should not go to the public, that should not be written, especially topics relating to marriage and sexuality. There is a way African communities have preserved this kind of knowledge just within the community. And we do not write about this because some of these involve taboos. We need to know what can be known, what can be spoken about in public, what cannot. If we understand these, then we are in the process of recovery. The next stage is mourning, lamenting for the continued assault on the historically oppressed and their social realities. We need to feel pain. If we do not reach a point where we feel bad that what happened to us is bad, we will not change because everything will be good. But as long as we begin to think, critically question some of the things that have been done to us, then it will be easy to start thinking about reversing or going back to the drawing board and to think about the whole process. Then we need to begin dreaming. We need to explore the culture and invoke histories, worldviews, and indigenous knowledge systems to theorize and imagine other possibilities that may exist for us. We need to dream other ways of doing research other than those which only serve the Western paradigms. Again, I take you back to the status of research in Africa. We said that the third layer or the outermost layer in which research is conducted among indigenous people without involving them has had no impact among African people. Why? This is because that research only serves the interest of the researcher using Western knowledge. They write about it, but whatever they write has got nothing to offer to the African indigenous people. The next thing we should do is commitment. When we when we rediscover and we have recovered, we mourn and we dream, we need to commit to the dreams. We need to define the roles of research community development, the roles of communities and the roles of the researchers. We need to know who is going to do what. Otherwise, just dreaming and mourning and recovering and discovering ourselves may not take us anywhere. The researcher must commit to giving the voice to the colonized other in the entire research process. So we need that commitment where the voice is given to the colonized other to talk about knowledge, to talk about, to interpret the data so that the findings are relevant to the social and cultural context of African people. We need to conduct research that change the local people. Like I said, if we're going to conduct research for the sake of getting or fulfilling the requirements for the degree that we are doing, whether it be master's or PhD, and not changing community, then there is no need. There is no need to engage or to start the process of decolonizing research in Africa. We need to commit to allowing local people to have control over their own knowledge and ways of knowing. So we need to commit and give back power. Remember, again, when settlers went to Africa, colonialists went to Africa, they thought they had power over the Africans. They had power over obtaining data and writing about it in books and in articles. That power must go back. As researchers, we need to commit ourselves to taking back that power to the African people. Then we need to take action, which involves transforming dreams and commitment into strategies for social transformation. We need to embrace participatory research methodologies that give the voice to the colonized other, to African indigenous people. When we write, we should write it according to the worldviews of Africans. We need to promote empowerment, inclusivity, and respect for all who are involved in the research. So African people must be respected. What is the way forward from here, friends? We know that research has the power to prescribe solutions to challenges in former colonized indigenous peoples and historically oppressed groups. As such, let us get involved in every process that changes the way we conduct research in Africa. Let us give back power to people. We should not perpetuate self-serving Western research methodologies, because when the West conduct research in African communities, they are not doing it for us. They are doing it to document us in their own way and for their benefit. Unfortunately, in most cases, as we have mentioned throughout this presentation, that research has got no benefit for the Africans. It only benefits them. And secondly, that research presents factually incorrect information. Research methodologies should stand on an equal footing with Western methodologies and paradigms. So we are not bringing African indigenous research in order to fight the West, to fight Western research, but we are bringing it as an alternative voice so that we can see reality presented by the people who are being researched, and that reality or that research should be able to help the local people. Indigenous research methodologies should be made an essential and integral aspect of research methodologies courses. So when we offer research courses in universities, let us involve indigenous research methodologies so that students can start learning at an early stage. Remember, we said that educational institutions, including schools and universities, have perpetuated the captivity of the mind, have perpetuated the dependence on Western ways of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination. So if we can start teaching indigenous research methodologies in schools, in universities, and in research methodology courses, this will help transform would-be researchers to start thinking about indigenous research methodologies. Researchers must problematize the captive mind or the colonized mind. We need to start questioning this and thinking, why do we do things that do not help us? We cannot continue with the status quo. We need to start asking ourselves that, why is it that 70 years, 60 years, 50 years, 40-something years after independence, we have conducted research, but there is no impact? It's because whatever research we conduct does not favor us. Again, remember that point, 3 forms of research. The second outer layer or the second inner layer. Actually, we said that there is research that is conducted in Africa, and it involves the participants of Africa. Most academics in Africa, most scholars in Africa, most researchers in Africa, they conduct research. However, they use Western methods in social science. And I feel personally that these are wrong methods to use, and this is why we do not see development, because we are just helping the West. We could be Africans in Africa conducting research, but as long as we keep using inappropriate Western research methodologies, we are just helping the West to document us in a wrong way, and therefore that research will have no impact on the African mind, which is in captivity, but also on the development of the continent. We need to ask the community what they would love us to research about. Sometimes we just conduct research in order to fulfill certain requirements or in order to get funding. We need to ask the people among which the research is being conducted so that we know what we really need to focus on. And we need to have participants of critical peers to review our analysis, and we mean Indigenous people to review our peers so that they counter check the facts and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. Bye bye.